Well, I think that started in August of 2003. Prior to that, we had met in a vineyard church, and there were some charismatic elements, but healing prayer was kind of out there and not really part of our experience. And one night I went to bed, and when I woke up the next morning, I was no longer in my own bed. I was in an ambulance, and I had no idea how I'd gotten there. Turns out I had a seizure, and Candy had called 911 in the middle of the night. That's our emergency number. And so the paramedics came, and the next thing I knew, I was in an ambulance. And so they took me to the emergency room and did some tests. And long story short, I was diagnosed with a brain tumor. So and it was kind of ironic because I'm a neuroscientist. I do brain
Yes.
imaging on other people. And
Yeah.
here I was with a brain tumor. I was 30 years old. Candy was it was 4 days before she was giving birth to our first child. So
Shocking.
she
Yeah.
was in the hospital with childbirth, and I was in the hospital at the same time having MRIs done on my head to figure out what was going on. And so our daughter was 2.5 weeks old when we got the diagnosis. And so, as a neuroscientist, I knew a little too much to be a good patient. I realized that this was really bad and it would most likely kill me, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. And so we've got this newborn baby, and I just got this medical death sentence.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I mean, the doctors essentially offered to watch and see what happens. And, there's not really a point in treating it too aggressively because at that point, the evidence was that regardless of treatment, people don't live, you live a certain amount of time, and having surgery or chemotherapy or radiation doesn't really change how long you live. And
Mm.
so the doctor said, well, let's just hold off and, treat it if we have to. So,
Mm.
so at that point, I had no other hope, and I desperately wanted to live. I didn't want to, I thought of my daughter. I didn't want her to be
Yeah.
an orphan. I didn't
Young
want Candy to
father.
be
Yeah.
a widow.
Yes.
I wanted to see my children grow up. At
Yes, of
that point, we had
course.
one. Um, and so we were very desperate. And it was about that time I remember thinking, well, I don't know if miracles happen, but if they do, I need to know.
Yes.
And so we asked our friends, hey, what do you know about, miracles, healings, healing prayer? Like, what do you know? Is there anything we can do? Because I'm willing to take some chances here
Yes.
because I have no other hope.
Mm.
None, not of surviving. And so some friends pointed us to some different ministries, and we thought, well, let's check them out. And so we ended up traveling all over the world eventually, first around the US and then some other countries, and just desperately looking for something real. And of course, I'm a scientist, right? I'm a professor, I'm a neuroscientist. So I'm not going to
Hmm.
just, swallow something whole because somebody dances around on a stage and says so.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm looking for something real. Like, is there
Yeah.
something real that will actually help,
Yeah.
in some way that you can actually show?
Hmm.
And so in the course of that, we saw a whole range of groups, different ministries. Some of them were seemed a little bit strange, a little bit out there. I think some of them were a bit put off. uh, but some of them, we made some good friends, and we found people who really cared, really, first of all, like they were people were giving up their lives and putting their time and volunteering,
Hmm.
and they genuinely cared. And
Yes.
so that kind of struck me. And the more we got into it, we started to hear these testimonies of healing, of people experiencing miraculous healing. And of course, I was I was paying attention to that because I
Yes.
needed hope. I was looking for
Yeah.
something, and
Yeah, absolutely.
so I was in this space of being interested in looking, and at the same time being somewhat skeptical because I know there's a lot of claims there, and I
Hmm.
mean this is my job as a scientist to look at things critically and try to pick them apart and see what withstands scrutiny. So there are things that I'm sure I would never have found if I hadn't gone looking for them. Uh, but there were a lot of things that we did find that really got our attention, and it seemed like something was happening. Some
Mm.
people are experiencing healing. And then the question became, what is this exactly? There's some phenomenon, but what is it? And how
Yeah.
does it work? And so that's how we got interested in it. It was not like we woke up one morning and thought, we're bored, let's look into miracles.
No,
It was very personal, very much,
definitely.
something that kind of happened to us rather than something we went looking for.
But it was a huge life event. But the interesting question rising up in me is now, so what happened? I mean, you were looking for healing, but you are
Yeah.
here a
Yeah,
few years
so
later.
it's over 21 years ago now, and I mean from what we know now at this point, I'm fine. Like I haven't had any symptoms for over 20 years. I never had surgery, chemo, radiation because again it wouldn't have helped. I was certainly open to it, but the doctor's like, well, there's not really a point. So
Yeah.
I mean, I had a lot of experiences. I was prayed for. I'm not sure how to describe them other than very powerful. There were
Mm.
times where I would be prayed for and it would feel like grabbing a live electrical wire.
Mm.
Um,
You hear
just,
that a lot. Yeah.
yeah. And so I don't know exactly what happened, but I can tell you the timeline. So I was going to these different ministries and lots of different ones and all Christian, and they would pray for me. And I'd have these experiences, and so I went back to the doctor after 3 months, and I said, "Well, I've had some unusual experiences, and I think something may
Yes.
have happened." And so the doctor said, "Well, we'll do our we'll test you every 3 months and see how the brain tumor is developing, and if we need to, introduce some more aggressive treatment to improve your quality of life." And so I said, well, let's see what happened. And so they did another MRI 3 months later. And I remember when Candy and I got the results because we thought, well, let's see if some miracle happened. And so we had a video camera rolling as I
Hmm.
opened this envelope with the results because, of course, it was all on paper and film back then. And so I opened it up and I read the results, and it said the brain tumor is still there. It still looks bad,
Oh
and I
no. Yeah.
thought, oh, after all
Bit
of that,
disappointing.
oh, well, that's an understatement. I mean,
Yeah.
because this isn't just like, I mean, this is life and death, right?
Yes,
Quite literally.
absolutely. Yeah.
And so at that point, I thought, well, I don't know. But what I do know is there's nothing else for me to do. So at that point, Candy and I talked it over, and I decided that I wasn't going to give up. I had seen enough at that point.
Mm.
I'd talked to people who had described like very remarkable healings, apparently miracles,
Hmm.
as their firsthand experience. I talked to a number of people by that point, and I had seen things happen in person. People who are claiming they've got, this these horrible ongoing pain, or
Hmm.
missing part of a bone, and it seems to grow back like in a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
And so I talked to people firsthand claiming that they had experienced all this
A
stuff.
lot of
And
testimonies. Yes.
yeah, a lot of testimonies. And so I thought, well, it's enough for me to consider that there's at least some possibility that something's really happening. And so I thought, well, I have nothing else. I'm not going to give up. So at that point I thought, well, I'm either going to get healed or I'm going to die trying. And
Mm.
so Candy and I
Great
agreed,
faith.
and So I mean, I had nothing, and it wasn't without cost because for me to travel and go to these healing meetings took time and money
Yeah.
and it was time away from Candy and our daughter. And
Yeah.
so there was some cost to it. But at that point, I thought, well, I'm taking a huge risk and I don't know if it'll if it'll work.
Yes.
But I've seen enough that gives me enough hope to go on. And I wouldn't want to not I wouldn't want to give up too quickly, especially since it's my life at stake and, you know, my daughter having a dad and Candy having a husband.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
um, so,
Well, and
so I traveled.
we had, oh yeah, we just to say that we had like encouragements along the way too, because I mean, one of these early firsthand experiences was a couple months into things. I was trying to carry around our baby so that he could go get prayer, but I had like this horrible pain going down my back, down one leg, and it making it difficult to do what I needed to do. And I mean,
Yes.
I felt ridiculous, like asking for prayer when he was the one who had this condition. But
Yeah.
one of these times that we were traveling, I did, like, we were actually visiting kind of back one of the vineyard churches that we had been a part of, and I got prayer several times during the day. And it was during the fourth time that I got prayer that instantly all of the pain left and never returned. And so it was like encouragements like that, and just kind of like I would describe them now as prophetic words, where we would just get crucial pieces of information that kind of kept us kind of pushing forward. But back to the timeline, Josh.
Yeah, but that's a whole journey. I mean, that sitting here 21 years later, healed, healthy. So I see. But that the whole journey. I mean, that's I'm interested in where is the turning point. I mean, 3 months later, the news was bad.
Yeah. So at that point, we began visiting various ministries, and this one ministry, run by Randy Clark, who was, the one who was preaching when the Toronto revival broke out in the mid '90s. And so his group was going to Cuba for a 1 week healing prayer mission kind of trip. And they said, well, if you want to come along, you just pay some money and come hang out with us for a week. And so I thought, well, that seems kind of weird, but I don't know. And I don't know if it's a good idea to travel like this while I have this medical condition. And so I remember I was praying and I said, God, I don't know, should I go to Cuba with this group? And I was coming back from another meeting and I went to buy some food in the airport and I opened up my wallet and there in my wallet was a Cuban 5-cent coin. And I'd never seen I'd never seen any Cuban money before. I mean, it's not like typical money that just shows up in your wallet. So I looked
That's
at that and I
interesting.
thought, I think I'll go to Cuba. I don't know, maybe
I think
God's
so
trying to tell me
too.
something.
You should
So
be blind
so
and
I
you don't do
did.
that.
Yeah, I did, and I spent a week there. And the very first day we found this little storefront church in Havana, and there were about 15, 20 of us in this group, and one of the people on this team I was with came rushing in and said, "Hey, everyone, there's a blind guy in the sidewalk. There's a guy walking with a cane. Let's go see if he wants to be prayed for his eyesight to be healed." And I thought, well, this ought to be interesting. so, so they went out and accosted this guy and they said, well, is it okay if we pray for you for your eyesight? And he was like, well, I guess. So he prayed with them, and within a few minutes, he started reading the license plates off these old 1950s cars they have. And I remember looking at this and thinking, what just happened here? Like, because he was walking with a cane, the kind that
Yeah.
blind people walk with, and
Yes.
and I thought, okay, either somebody just pulled a very elaborate setup or something really happened. And
And it was the
so
last. Yeah.
yeah, so I thought, well, that's interesting. And by the end of the trip, our leaders had left. They had a family emergency, and it was just the random people like me who ended up going on this trip. And it was Sunday, and we found this church nearby where we were staying in southern Cuba, and we showed up, and the pastor said, "Oh, we got some Americans here. Want to say a few words of encouragement." And so one of our team grabbed the microphone and said, "Yeah, well, we've been here a week, and we've been praying with people, and we've seen lots of miraculous healings, and
Hmm.
so there are about 300 people in this church, and one of them at that point, as soon as we started talking about healing prayer and people getting healed, they all mobbed us. They're like, "We want some," and so this
Yeah.
new friend and I started praying for a woman, and she said, "Well, I've been blind for several years," and so we prayed with her, and after a while, she basically screamed like she like, "I can see." And I stood all the way across the church and held up fingers, and she could count them, and we were like,
Amazing.
what just happened here? Like, and so that I think was kind of a turning point for me to watch, like, apparently blind people having their eyesight restored like multiple times, and
Yeah.
I'd never seen that before,
No.
and I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't traveled like that. And so I think now I'm writing a book now about a lot of these experiences that'll come out probably a little over a year from now,
Oh,
probably
it's interesting.
early 2026. And uh, so I in that book I explore more. So could you explain this medically, right?
Mhm.
Is there a
Yeah.
is there a
What's the
natural
working
medical
mechanism? What
explanation?
happened? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you have to ask those questions, and I think, I mean, I'm in a kind of unique position because I'm a Christian and I'm also a neuroscientist,
Yes.
right? So I look for these experiences, but I also think about them critically, like, can you explain this?
Hmm.
And that sort of I don't know, I think foreshadows what we've done with the Global Medical Research Institute. But anyway, back to the story. So I
Sure.
got back from that, and I had more MRIs, and after about 6 months from the original diagnosis, the the test results came back that, well, it's not growing, so I don't know. And after about
Hmm.
9 months, so they were doing MRIs every 3 months. After 9 months, they said, well, it's still there, but it's not growing. It's not really doing anything. And to be sure, like, some of these things can sit there for a while and not really grow. And the typical course is that they start off kind of slowly, um, and then they transform into higher grade tumors, and then it's a
Hmm.
matter of a month, and that's
Yes.
the end.
Hmm.
So but at that point it wasn't growing, and I thought, well, maybe maybe something happened. And so after a year, they did another test, and it looked like um, it was still something was still there. But I mean, I looked at it, I thought that almost looks a little smaller, but I can't tell. It's kind of within the
Hmm.
margin of. Um, but at that point, it just wasn't doing anything. And I kept going to these prayer meetings, and I would have these experiences of, like I said, it feels like grabbing an electrical wire, um, and in the end it kind of stopped in its tracks. So I kept, then I started getting MRIs. For a while it was every 3 months, then I went to every 6 months, and then I went to like every year, and then I went to 18 months. And the last MRI I had was 7 years after the original diagnosis,
Hmm.
and the reading came back that, well, it looks like scar tissue. And so uh, and so that was that was 21 years ago now. And the last, I was having multiple seizures. So it wasn't like this was just a one-off seizure. Like I started having, I had more seizures. And
Hmm.
so something had happened, but the last seizure I had was in January of 2004. So over 20 years ago. I
So
never, like I
no
said, I
more
never had
symptoms.
surgery. Yeah, so I never had surgery or chemo or radiation. the symptoms stopped, and whatever it is just never grew, and so that was that was the end of it. So, I'm healthy and symptom free and have been for over 20 years. So
wow, that's an amazing testimony. And so what did the doctor say? I mean, that's the question everybody asks, probably.
Well, yeah. So I think, if I put on my critical neuroscientist hat and ask, so what was going on? There are several possibilities. One is that it was a tumor and, God did a miracle.
Yeah.
But I think there are differential diagnoses. One is mesial temporal sclerosis, which is it's a degeneration of specific brain regions that in some cases can result in seizures. I think as I look through the medical literature, when people have that, the seizures, I couldn't find any examples out of a lot of literature that I looked at where the seizures started at age 30 or older, like they did for me. Like I never had a seizure in my life until I was 30, and then I suddenly started having a bunch. So typically, having new onset seizures later in life like that, it's not mesial temporal sclerosis. So I think then another possibility is a congenital defect called a focal cortical dysplasia, and that's a situation where the brain just grows a little, a little part of the brain grows a little oddly in the womb, but there again, it's almost unheard of for someone with that to start having seizures as late in life as I did. Now, I will add, it's not impossible. There, in about somewhere between 1% and 2% of cases, it's possible for seizures to start as late in life as I experience. It's just so I think the only way you could actually say exactly what happened would be if I had a biopsy at the time.
And they didn't, obviously. Huh?
Well, I discussed it with the neurosurgeon. I said, what are the risks and benefits of having a biopsy? And they said, well, if it's a tumor, it's not going to change how we treat you because there's no cure. So it's not really going to help you. And they said, and if we do the biopsy, there's a small chance that the biopsy itself could kill you because the area is right next to a major blood vessel. And if we hit that, it'll kill you. And so I said, okay, so there's no benefit, but a lot of risk to doing a biopsy, besides which you're going to poke around in my brain. Yeah, for what? So in the end, I decided there was no good reason to do a biopsy. And so because of that, I can't say 100% that it couldn't have been, a focal cortical dysplasia. It's super unlikely. Like by far the most likely scenario is that there was a brain tumor. I mean, when you have a mass that shows up on imaging and new onset seizures in midlife, it's almost always, like generally it's brain tumor. So
I would add in here, though, that there were other kinds of experiences that we had along the way, which point much more in the direction of something beyond just kind of scar tissue, et cetera, was at play. And so before the seizure even happened, I had a couple of experiences. One, which was, we would say, kind of just like a warning from God that something was going to happen. And we needed to choose whether to greet that with faith or with fear. And the second was a dream in which I heard a specific name of something that was going to try and kill us or destroy us. And I didn't say anything about this second experience to Josh until the night of the medical diagnosis. And so this is now 2.5 weeks after we have this newborn daughter. And so I was just kind of up in the middle of the night and nursing our daughter, and sensed from God that I needed to know what the name was from my dream. And turns out it was the name of a book connected with a particular group that we were kind of praying kind of against them in a sense, because we thought it wasn't a very good group. And we personally interacted with someone, and mostly Josh personally interacted with someone from that group. So it's like, well, that got my attention. Like, why? Like, that seems very coincidental. But more than that, a few hours after this, I let Josh sleep the rest of the night. But then when I told him about this name from my dream, he essentially leapt out of bed, started turning somersaults around our bedroom floor. His head whipped back and shouted no at me whenever I said seizure, tumor, or the name from my dream. He could not say the name of Jesus. So there was something going on here. I mean, I felt evil presence come into the room, and such that I could never, like, if I ever had any doubts, is Jesus real? I can't have those doubts, because there was something that hated Jesus that was in that room with us. And this went on for like 45 minutes. And then it was clear nothing left. And then we kind of had some pastors, leaders come over to the house. We start telling them this, they start praying, same thing starts happening. And he's flopping all over the ground. I mean, this can be a very long story, so this is the very short version of it. But we basically started finding some people who were familiar with what we would now describe as deliverance ministry.
Yes.
And a lot of these powerful experiences that Josh is talking about, like some of them were positive, like he sensed the Holy Spirit, but some of them were very negative experiences. And that we can very much give you a timeline for that. It was 5 months after the beginning of this that there was, in a sense, a final showdown with kind of specifically that spirit from my dream, with like the leader of a group calling that thing out by name, and it being a quite dramatic kind of deliverance. And that's what really set the stage for the beginning of the miracles that we started observing. So I think that's just, again, like, I think medical records in and of themselves tell you a part of a story, and testimonies tell you a part of a story. But it's when you layer those things together and that you really can get a fuller picture of what's taking place. And especially when you have these very unusual and only restricted to this context kind of spiritual experiences, that it makes it seem a lot more likely that this is more than just his brain grew kind of funny.
Now, that's the thing with research, of course. What I also discussed with Dr. Kruithof is that you have to look at the whole picture. It's a holistic scientific approach where you also have to interview and ask people what happened. And you can't put it on a screen on an MRI scan, or,
Well, and this is part of what I think gave me some hope and inspiration that there might be a spiritual kind of solution to what I was experiencing, because I mean, what Candy's describing was something I was fully awake when this happened. I was fully conscious, and Candy said, I had this dream and I heard this name of like an evil spirit in my dream. Does this mean anything? And I said, no, name doesn't really mean anything. But as soon as she said it, it was like something inside of me just got, I don't know, stirred up or something. And I said, I don't know, there's something weird going on. I think we need to pray. And so we started praying, and Candy said, well, if there's a spirit by this name, and keep in mind, we know nothing about,
this was not a part of our vineyard, any of our church background.
No,
we
had
you had a personal training,
no real framework. No framework for this. And so Candy said, well, there's a spirit named, this name, then just leave us alone in Jesus' name. And as soon as she said that, it was like, the best I can describe it is if someone taps your kneecap and your knee kind of jerks, and you didn't tell it to jerk, it's just doing that. And it was like my whole body was doing that. My whole body I was shaking, rolling around on the floor, and I'm fully conscious. I feel like I have all my faculties, and yet something is making me. And I remember thinking at the time, this is so bizarre. Like, why am I, and I'm not having a seizure because I'm fully conscious. And so Candy would say, leave him alone in Jesus' name. And my head would just involuntarily whip around at her and scream, "No!" And then I would like cover my mouth, like, "Oh, I didn't mean to say that," like, and
And you
so
were not familiar with this at all. I mean, some people come
no,
from a denomination, they know about all these things, but you had no idea.
no framework
we
at
never
all.
watched horror movies. I mean, we had no introduction to this that I can ever remember.
That's a lot of evidence to me, especially if you don't know.
we were thinking, what do we do? I mean, there are no pigs around here. If there's a demon, where do we send it? Like, like we've got a cat, like, but maybe that's a bad idea. Or maybe we can send it into a squirrel or something outside. Like, I
literally said that. That's as much as I could think. Like, well, I read the Bible stories, but that's all I knew.
Yeah.
So, and and I remember even in the middle of that, I said, I sort of managed to say to Candy, like, "Don't call 911. I'm not having a seizure." And she was like, "Well, I can see that." And I said, like, basically, do something. And so she says, "Well, tell it you belong to Jesus." And I said, "Well," I belong to Jesus. And my throat locked up, and I couldn't finish saying Jesus. I thought, and at that point, we were both thinking, okay, this is really weird. And so I think, what came out of that was this thought that it seems like there might be a spiritual kind of problem here. And if it's a spiritual problem, it requires a spiritual solution. Mm-hmm. And so, but what does that look like? We have no idea. And so that's also part of what put us on this path of looking for miraculous healings.
Yeah, but it's a really practical, journey you had on learning about these things. I mean, no books, no denomination, no church where you read and learned this, but it just came into your lives and you had to deal with it.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the deliverance part ended about 5 months later. I was playing guitar. We were at a little Bible study, a prayer meeting, and I was playing guitar and we were singing some songs, and I just kind of slumped over, and the guy leading the meeting came up to me and said, "You spirit," and he named that name Candy heard in her dream. And he said, "You leave him right now." And as soon as he said that, it was the strangest thing. I mean, I don't know, that's kind of a relative thing now, but I didn't feel sick, but I suddenly had to vomit. And I remember I threw the guitar aside and I ran to the bathroom and just out of nowhere just vomited. And after a few minutes, I sort of sheepishly went back into the room and I was like, "Sorry about that." And I don't know what happened. I didn't feel sick at all. I just suddenly, as soon as you said, leave, as soon as you told it to leave, I just suddenly had to vomit. And then as I came back in, people were like, "Did you smell that?" Like, and I was like, "Well, it wasn't me." And someone said, "No, it wasn't you." The entire building smelled like sulfur. Like, this was a big building. The whole thing smelled like sulfur for a few minutes, right as I ran out to vomit. And then after a few minutes, the sulfur smell dissipated and was gone. And I don't know, I think it was more like a sewer exploded or something. Like, it was a horrible smell that filled the entire building. So, and I was like, "Look, that wasn't me." That's not possible for that to have been me. So,
no, impossible.
But after that, that happened right after the very last seizure that I had. And after that episode, I never had any more seizures.
Wow, that's an amazing testimony.